Right. I'm really excited to introduce Alex Sutton. Alex is currently a teaching and research lecturer at Bangor University. Previously, he was a postdoctoral fellow at Kansas State University, and he got his PhD in integrative biology from the University of Guelph under Brian Norris, where he worked on a long-term study of Canada jays, which a declining population of Canada jays. He has several papers, most notably his review paper titled The Biotic and Abiotic Drivers of Timing and Breeding, Consequences of Early Breeding in a Changing World, won him the Wesley Lanyon Award from the American Ornithological Society. It's a very prestigious paper award for the best review paper in ornithology. He has a number of scholarships and awards, including the Wesley Lanyon, and also I have to make fun of this, the Queen Elizabeth II Graduate Scholarship in Science and Technology, because he's Canadian. That's their president. So it's just like the presidential graduate fellowship, I guess, right? Yeah. At Bangor, Alex teaches field biology and ornithology and field ecology, and also a course on climate change, and which will be a big part of what he's talking about here. So in his free time, it looks like Alex climbs a lot. So there you go, Alex.
Thanks very much, Sahas. It's fantastic to be here. It's a station that I've heard so much about from friends over the years, and especially being related to a jay project, you inevitably hear about the scrub jays. So it's really exciting to be able to talk to you all today. So like Sahas said, most of my work kind of focuses on climate change and the implications of climate change on a variety of different taxonomic groups and organisms. So I hope I don't need to convince anyone in this room that the world is fundamentally changing. And when we think of climate change, we're primarily thinking about kind of changes in annual temperature, changes in precipitation, but all of these things are acting in concert with one another. And one of the really fascinating things for me is that if you look across these maps, you see that it's not uniform. There's a lot of spatial heterogeneity in terms of how quickly climate is changing and how kind of precipitation and temperature are both changing at the same time. Now, alongside this spatial heterogeneity, there's also considerable temporal heterogeneity. And so you can look at this map, this corona sequence, where you see that changes are kind of accelerating, both in terms of magnitude and increasing variation. And these two axes, this increasing in kind of mean temperatures and the increased variance, are promoting a number of novel challenges that wildlife have to adapt to in order to persevere in these changing climates. And so this is going to seem like a very trivial example, but I think nobody in the room would say that these three organisms are going to be responding to climate change in the same way. We often think of kind of plants, herbs, and birds as kind of being different poster childs with respect to how they might be responding to changing climatic conditions. But another aspect of this is when closer related species are exposed to maybe similar challenges, how are those organisms potentially responding to these environmental conditions? Are they showing kind of consistent and correlative responses, or do they start to deviate in terms of their responses, where some may be better able to adapt to these changing conditions than others, which might become locally extirpated or even extinct over time? And underlying this kind of variation of responses is multiple aspects that we need to consider, both on an ecological and evolutionary timescale. So we can think about behaviors and in terms of interactions or the behaviors of an organism that might either buffer an individual from changing climatic effects, or it might actually make them more susceptible to changing environmental conditions. Additionally, evolutionary history and genetic components might allow some species additional plasticity, or it might constrain them in the potential responses they have. And alongside this spatial heterogeneity and a lot of temperature and precipitation climate effects, we see that ranges and habitats within a species range are rapidly changing at different rates. And underlying a lot of these kind of evolutionary and behavioral responses are these physiology and trait aspects that we need to consider as well, which are the way that an organism is going to be interacting with the environment that it is in. And so over the course of my talk today, I'm going to be using two study systems to kind of understand how these kind of variable responses might manifest both in time and space. And so I'm going to first talk about tallgrass prairie forbs. So forbs are flowering plants that aren't grasses, at least for the purposes of the talk today. I'm aware now I'm talking with plant people who might disagree with that definition, so adding that caveat. And so in particular, I'm going to be talking about some work that I did as a postdoc at Kansas State, where we were interested in kind of multiple interacting aspects of multiple facets of global change that I'll get into in a minute. And in particular, we were primarily interested in population and community dynamics, understanding how kind of co-occurring species might respond in different ways to these novel conditions that they've been exposed to. And then I'm going to switch to hole nesting birds, so a group of 3 species, blue tits, great tits, and pied flycatchers, that we can leverage some long-term data from hole nesting bird populations across the Netherlands to understand how behavior might drive kind of context-dependent responses. And in particular, what are the consequences on individual fitness from kind of timing of breeding and where a bird is deciding to breed in the first place? So to start off, I'm going to get you all to imagine that you're away from the scrub and instead in the grassland. So this is kind of a common sight in the tallgrass prairies of central North America, where you see this complex mosaic of a grass forest or a sea of grass that is kind of interspersed with these flowering plants. And so although forbs don't make up much of the actual biomass of the tallgrass prairie, they're a major component of the biodiversity, making up as much as 80% of the plant species that exist here. And so tallgrass prairies, much like the scrubland, are maintained by kind of intense disturbance dynamics that allow for the perseverance of grasslands over time and prevent woody encroachment. And in particular, we often think of fire and grazing as being 2 major factors that actually maintain grasslands over time. And so what's really cool is we can actually see very easily the effects that both grazing and fire return intervals have on these tallgrass prairie communities. And so here are just a couple examples where you can see an annually burned plot on the left side here and an infrequently burned plot. So you start to see structural differences, both in the extent of kind of shrub coverage and wood begun to encroach. And in this area on the bottom, you can also see that this is an annually burned plot. And I believe this is the plot that's burned every 20 years. So you start to see really divergent responses just based on a relatively short spatial scale, but that differ in the intensity and the frequency of fire. And so what I was interested in doing was actually looking at how fire, weather, and then the presence of native herbivores actually kind of shape communities and promote differential responses at the population level and what the consequences of those are for their communities as well. And so when we're thinking about this in a very simplified way, we can imagine that change in abundance over time is going to potentially differ between species. So in this plot, you can imagine that one species has increased in abundance over time and the other has decreased, or they might show correlated responses. And the extent to which species show either divergent or correlated responses is going to lead to very different community dynamics. And so what we were interested in doing was characterizing the extent of this interspecific variation in response to kind of weather, fire, and herbivory, and how these responses actually shape potential population and community dynamics of the tallgrass prairies. And so this is work that I did as a postdoc with Alison Louthan at Kansas State University. And one of the really cool things about being at KSU was that we have access to the Kanza Prairie Biological Station. So this is a long-term ecological research station located just outside of Manhattan, Kansas. And you can see that it's located in one of the largest tall grass prairie remnants that we have left. Tall grass prairies have experienced kind of rapid degradation or shifts where almost 90 or over 90% of the tall grass prairie that used to exist is no longer there. And so what Kanza does is it has a huge stretch of land and it is able to run these large-scale manipulative experiments where you can see that each one of these areas indicated or outlined in white is a separate treatment on the landscape scale. And so what they do is they vary the presence or absence of herbivores, how frequently fires actually happen, and there's a number of different other grazing types, so cattle grazing, bison grazing, and some other additional treatments as well. But this replicated design provides a really amazing study system to actually look at these interactive effects of fire because you can actually look at them occurring over a relatively short spatial scale and with considered experimental manipulations as well across the landscape. And so alongside this landscape level experimentation, they've also been collecting regular vegetation plots. So these surveys have been conducted since 1983. They have transects that are made up of 5 sampling plots, and there's 4 transects in each of the watersheds that we were focusing on. And so what's really nice is these are replicate plots along the transect to provide us with additional data, and they vary across soil types as well. And so one thing that they do is rather than recording just straight abundance, they actually group abundance, and that will become important in just a minute, into 7 different density categories rather than the actual abundance of the plant cover there. And so these transects are also replicated in each of the watersheds, as I mentioned before. And so what this allows us to do is actually kind of leverage the density structured nature of the data to make what are called density structured models. And I won't get into the specifics of this because the math gets a little complicated, but basically what they do is they're estimating the transition probabilities of going from one abundance class to the next. And so what that is allowing us to do is look at what actually the influence of fire, of herbivory, and of weather is on these transition probabilities. And we can also then use these matrices that are created by these density structured models to fix our parameter values and forecast into the future to project what these responses are across time. And so the model itself was a multinomial logistic regression where we included cover class that it was in, the presence or absence of bison, climate across 3 different levels, so the 5th, 50th, and 95th percentiles, fire frequency, so how frequently it was burned. Within our treatments, it was 1, 4, or 20-year burns. We included 2 soil types, and then the species ID as well. And so this bracket is indicating that we all model as well to allow us to vary all of these things across time. And so what this allowed us to do was then actually project and understand that the impact of this interspecific variation across time. So in this example, you can see that fire frequency differs. There's the presence or absence of bison, and then these 3 weather types. And so essentially what we were doing was just predicting what the abundance of these plant species was going to be. And so as is expected, we saw quite a bit of interspecific variation. So here we have predicted cover on the y-axis, and then we have the weather conditions across, and then we have the FRI, or the fire return interval. So 1 is these top 2 panels, 4, and then 20. And then the presence or absence of bison. So bison are present on the right and absence on the left. And so the first thing you'll notice is that forbs in general are relatively low in their percent cover. And again, this aligns with our expectations where there's going to be relatively few forbs that actually become a dominant force in this otherwise grass-dominated landscape. The other really interesting thing is that we see when bison are present and the fire return interval is quite low, we start to see wider variation between species. And so that's really fascinating. And so we were not necessarily expecting this, but it fits with what we know in terms of how bison and fire both create increased heterogeneity in this landscape, create openings for forbs to kind of pop up in amongst the grasses. And so then if we actually start to kind of truly understand the effects of bison on this landscape, we wanted to go one step further and calculate what's known as a log response ratio. And what this allowed us to do was basically compare directly conditions with bison or without bison. And so for the purposes of kind of interpretation, all you need to know is that a larger number above 0 means that there's an increase in abundance in the presence of bison, whereas below 0 means that there is a decrease in abundance. So basically, we're wanting to know if plants became more common or less common in the presence of bison, with all other conditions being maintained. And so what we see is indeed that there is quite divergent responses in these log response ratios, where across these weather conditions, we see that there are kind of these divergent context dependent responses at a species specific level. So again, quite divergence where some actually peak in the median, some peak in the warm or dry conditions, and it was really fascinating. And I should also say that all of the dashed lines indicate species that weren't actually significantly different across the weather types, whereas all solid lines indicate that there was difference between the weather conditions. And so this was quite interesting, showing that species are responding in quite different ways with or across different weather types. Additionally, we saw that these responses were actually fairly consistent across soil types. So there was less impact of soil types as a driver in kind of these divergent responses across time, especially with respect to bison. But what was particularly interesting was this interesting relationship where we see kind of very strong interspecific differences at low fire return intervals, so at annual burns, but the actual response becomes homogenized at these longer fire return intervals. And so that got us thinking, how would this community actually respond if all species are starting to respond in the same way as fire return intervals become stronger, even in the presence of bison? And so what we did was actually calculated a Bray-Curtis dissimilarity index. So this means that 1 on this scale is that the community is more divergent, more speciose and more diverse, whereas 0 means that they're all quite homogeneous. And so what we see is that in the presence of bison, there's strong community dynamics that are staying quite divergent or different across all of these different weather conditions. Additionally, we see that bison are maintaining kind of species diversity in across soil types, but as fire return intervals actually get longer, we see communities are becoming more and more similar. And so what's particularly fascinating about this result is that bison often prefer to graze in annual burns. It's fresh grass, it's the most nutrient rich, and as soon as fire return intervals go down, they tend to avoid those areas. And so we might expect that there's these strong effects, but as bison start to avoid those areas, this is consistent with kind of what we'd expect in terms of lower community diversity as forbs kind of get pushed out by other vegetation types. And so just to quickly summarize this part, we see that, yes, there is kind of a wide variety of these context-dependent responses across fire, herbivory, and weather types. And what's particularly fascinating is that the presence of a native herbivore, in this case bison, might actually buffer these communities from the deleterious effects of ongoing climate change. So across these different weather conditions that we estimated, bison were able to kind of preserve community composition and buffer them from these deleterious effects. So this kind of demonstrates that there are a suite of factors that could influence communities through different population processes. But from my perspective, one of the slightly frustrating things is that we can't kind of get at these individual level responses with this long-term data because it's collected at a species-specific level at each of these plots. And additionally, I'm particularly interested, being a birder at heart, in kind of how individual decisions and their behavior might actually promote these differential responses to changing climatic conditions. And so now, to shift away from the tall grass prairies, I had to include at least one J in this presentation. And so this is something that I'm intimately familiar with growing up around a provincial park where I ended up doing my PhD research. But this is a Canada jay female incubating eggs in the middle of a snowstorm. And I think what's incredible is wondering why this female has chosen to breed in such inhospitable conditions. Because the choice to breed in kind of late winter and expose yourself to these snowy conditions, sub-zero temperatures, sometimes as low as -40, means that this individual has to shape their lifespan or their whole annual cycle around being able to breed. So like the scrub jays, the adults are a food caching bird. It facilitates not only their overwinter survival, but also their late winter reproduction. And it can also fuel nestlings and allow them to persevere in harsh conditions when fresh food is limited in the environment. And so this gets me thinking about why would you actually choose to breed at a specific time? And when we think about timing, it dictates a lot of different things. And first and foremost, we can imagine that you have both of interest, kind of this distribution of lay dates within a population and the subsequent hatch days associated with that variation. And now, when an individual chooses to breed, is going to expose them to a real range of different conditions. So we can think about different thermal properties of breeding, different resource abundance, and also differential rates of predation rate. And so when an individual chooses to breed, and if we think about this in terms of within a population, they're going to be exposed to very different conditions compared to an individual breeding just next door. And so what I think is fascinating is often breeding is timed with peak resource abundance during the greatest time of need. And so in this case, with the great tit system that I'll move into in just a moment, they are well known to synchronize their breeding with peak caterpillar emergence. And so this means that they're hoping to have their hatch dates just before peak caterpillar abundance so that the caterpillar resources are rich and plentiful in the environment while the nestlings are about 7 to 10 days old, which is one of the greatest energetic demanding times. And so what this means is that if you are mistiming breeding with respect to kind of these peaks and resources, there can be a variety of different consequences. Well-characterized responses in terms of clutch size, juvenile survival or nestling survival, and then even adult survival as well, can all stem from just the decision of when to actually breed. And so this means that individuals have to interpret cues in the environment to try and time their breeding appropriately. With the great tit system, spring temperature is a major driver of oak bud burst, which has a consequential effect on caterpillar emergence. And so they're trying to time their nest building to coincide based on these cues. And so when they're actually deciding to breed is going to dictate the number of eggs that they lay, when they're actually laying them, with consequences for brood size, and then continuing on and so forth. And so we can think about this variation in terms of these distributions across the population that I've showed you before, but also this distribution allows us to potentially predict when conditions might be most favorable or when timing of breeding might be most advantageous within the population. And so in this case, you would imagine that breeding at kind of the peak, so the average time, might mean that you're breeding at the same time that individuals breeding alongside you have all chosen to try and accurately predict this window. You'd imagine that evolutionary and ecological forces have promoted selection on when individuals should breed, and that a majority of the population should be best timed for that. And when these conditions are true, you might imagine that average is going to be the best. So this kind of contradicts some of what you might expect, because, I mean, there's the adage, the early bird gets the worm, but this might actually be the second best strategy in terms of breeding early gives you some additional time for insurance. So if your nest fails, maybe you then can breed again or attempt to breed again. Also, in terms of energetic peaks, if you are early, you might be just before the peak, but you're still accessing resources as they're becoming more abundant in the environment. And this also could have consequences on kind of fledgling survival, as they might be fledging from the nest when resources are at their peak. In contrast, I think nobody would disagree with me to say that late breeding is the worst of the three situations. And in this case, you'd imagine that missing this peak in abundance will mean that you're just catching it later and later in the season. And so this has consequences, and almost uniformly, there's always an indication that late breeding birds perform more poorly, and they potentially have the greatest consequences on their own survival as well. And so when we're thinking about timing of breeding, I've kind of illustrated this in terms of absolute time of the year, but we can also think of timing of breeding in two different ways. And so the first is going to be thinking about these absolute effects. And so when an individual chooses to breed at a given time of the year is going to expose it to different biotic and abiotic conditions, primarily through these environmental conditions and resource availability. However, you can also think of timing with respect to kind of relative timing, and these are going to shape kind of density-dependent processes and potentially shape the habitat that's available to an individual as well. And so these separate processes potentially have different effects, and it means that we should potentially try and consider understanding the overall fitness benefit of a specific time of breeding with both these absolute and relative conditions. And so in order to do this, I am collaborating with Joey Barrett, who's at the Netherlands Institute of Ornithology, and they have been collecting this incredible data set. And so they have 4 primary breeding populations located across the Netherlands of blue tit, great tit, and pied flycatchers breeding at each of these sites. And so when we filtered the data for only the nests that had all the information we needed, we're using over 33,000 clutches from over 18,000 females. And so this is kind of an absurd number, and you don't see this many places, but this is the real strength of studying birds in nest boxes, where they're breeding in a predictable location, and you can just walk up to a box, open it, and know what the nest success is, rather than tramping around the scrub looking for a bird that does not want you to find it. And so what we did is basically parameterized an equation, and I promise this will be the only equation you see, where we considered kind of fecundity as a function of absolute and relative fitness effects, juvenile survival, and adult survival as well. And so what we did is used all of the data and parameterized a general additive model, or a GAM, and then this was used to calculate kind of overall fitness effects and how both fecundity, so the number of young being produced, their survival, and adult survival all added together to shape fitness outcomes. And so I'll show you a series of plots that are all quite similar. And so the first one is going to have absolute first lay date. And then in this case, this is the number of fledglings per female per year. And so what's interesting is the number of fledglings in this population actually doesn't vary considerably across a given season. So nestling production is actually fairly stagnant across time, and this has been found in several other studies as well. Additionally, we don't really see any variation in nestling production across the relative first lay dates. And so in this case, we have a mean-centered value. So 0 represents average, negative numbers are going to be earlier, positive numbers are later. And so what's fascinating is we see there's not really any variation in nestlings produced over time, and this maybe fits with general life history theory, where certain individuals are going to be able to produce, whereas others might suffer consequences associated with this. In contrast, though, we do start to see some stronger effects on the probability of those fledglings actually recruiting into the population. And so in this case, we measured the probability of actually recruiting in 2 different ways. So on the top here, you have the probability that any nestlings from your nest recruited. So just one had to recruit for that nest to have recruited any. And then on the bottom, it's if the nest produced any recruits, what was the proportion of young that actually recruited into the population? And so what we see here is some interesting trends where we actually see that earlier breeding birds have a higher probability of producing any recruits. And it's kind of a wonky relationship, but there's not really too much of a difference in terms of the proportion of young that were recruited afterwards. Now, in contrast, we see some really interesting relationships when we're treating lay date in terms of relative lay date. And in particular, what I find fascinating is there is this hump-shaped distribution where it seemingly is not great to be early and best to be average. But there are these kind of stronger consequences for being late. And again, there's a higher proportion of young that are recruiting into the population from early, and it seems to be worse to be late in the year. And alongside that, we also see some interesting trends with female survival, where in this case, it's actually that later breeding birds in an absolute sense seem to have higher survival probabilities. This might be counterintuitive, but also makes sense because they're exposed to less harsh conditions as temperatures are warming throughout the breeding season. But in a relative sense, we again see these hump-shaped distributions where it's best to actually be average. And so this is fascinating because it really highlights kind of potentially 2 separate processes that are occurring where if we're thinking in terms of an absolute sense, we lose quite a bit of information from the relative lay date, which varies between individuals within a year, whereas absolute might not mean actually that it's incredibly favorable as the food peak is changing in timing every year. And so if we put together all of these effects, so the fecundity effects, the juvenile survival, and these female effects, we start to see some interesting relationships when we add it all together. And so these are partial plots. Again, I'll remind you, so every variable in the model is being held constant. So that's why there's some interesting relationships here. But again, there's some wonky relationships with absolute lay date. This peak largely we predict that it corresponds to the fact that great tits in the population used to be double brooded. And so that's why there's this potential second peak. But we also see these kind of strong hump-shaped distributions for relative lay date as well, which I find quite interesting. So to summarize, we do see that there's it's maybe best to be average, second best to be early, and worse to be late. And additionally, what I find particularly fascinating is that these 3 species all breeding in the same area are showing potentially divergent responses to these kind of timing effects, meaning that there might be some variation in the underlying mechanisms that are promoting kind of fitness maxima across these species. And one thing I didn't really get into with respect to the GAMS, but relative lay date is coming out as a much stronger term in all of these effects than absolute lay date. So when we're accounting for the effect of relative lay date, there's actually a smaller effect of absolute lay date on fitness. And so right now I've talked about kind of timing of breeding, but the effects of kind of individual variation aren't constrained just to timing in a single breeding season. And we also see that there's strong interannual variation in reproduction across these years that correspond likely both to the timing of the caterpillar peak. And so you might think of the mismatch hypothesis, which was pioneered with these study species where advancing food peaks basically advanced more rapidly than individuals could track them, meaning that they had fewer resources available. And there's also variation in the magnitude of the caterpillar peak across time. And so in low caterpillar years, there's lower reproductive performance and fewer young being produced, which is probably accounting for quite a bit of this variation over time. And this effect also isn't restricted to just timing. We also see that there's considerable spatial heterogeneity, which is particularly fascinating to me. And so this is work that's being done by a PhD student working with me, Charlotte Bendel, and who is co-supervised by Joey Barrett. And so what we were interested in doing was actually looking at these long-term records to understand how potential microhabitat variation within a single study site is leading to kind of variable responses. And so in order to characterize that, we looked at nest records across the 450 nest boxes within this population. And what's fascinating is it allows us over time to calculate kind of variation in occupancy rates for all the species combined and variation in the number of young that are fledged across this. And I hope what you see is that there is considerable variation. And what's fascinating and particularly impactful about these plots for me any of the population models that have been conducted to date. Although it seems intuitive that we wouldn't expect all nest boxes to kind of present the same habitat or the same environmental conditions, we often treat individuals breeding at a study site in a given year as being exposed to the same environmental conditions when we can see that there's kind of considerable variation in terms of the number of young and occupancy rates. And if we delve into this a little bit deeper, we can also see that this variation is species specific. And so in this case, great tits are on the left here, blue tits in the middle, and pied flycatchers on the right here. And we see that, again, although some of the patterns seem to be roughly consistent with lower reproductive success in this area, there's also considerable heterogeneity, and that heterogeneity varies between species. And this also manifests in terms of occupancy rates at these boxes, where we can see that some boxes are seldomly occupied by each of these species. So this is mean occupancy of a box as the horizontal line, and you see that there's considerable variation. And what's particularly fascinating about this is that great tits are often the bullies in this population, so they'll be able to breed kind of preferentially in whatever box that they would like. And in many cases, blue tits will be evicted or will just choose not to breed near a great tit. And as an individual settles, it's also constrained by its nearest neighbor that could be a conspecific that could compete, and they try to space themselves out. Flycatchers, however, come a little bit after, and so they might actually be breeding after the great tit breeding kind of effort has peaked. And so this means that they might have access to a greater number of boxes as well. And so these interspecific trends in terms of occupancy can illuminate potential competition dynamics or settlement dynamics if individuals breeding at a specific time are trying to select things for a particular resource. And so I hope what I showed you today is there's kind of this range of context-dependent and interspecific responses to a number of different climatic conditions, but how these manifest are largely species specific, and we need to try and understand these mechanisms that promote variable responses to climate, as they can provide insight into a number of different processes and can also help to illuminate kind of timing effects or spatial effects across broader scales. And so with that, that's the end of my talk, and I'd be happy to take questions as you kind of look at an oak woodland that I'm more used to in North Wales. So thanks very much.
Do you have any ideas about what cues these birds are responding to directly when they choose their time to breed? Like, is it mostly environmental variables, or are they paying attention to the behavior of other birds?
It's a great question, and I think it's actually a mix of both. So there's been quite a bit of research that's gone into kind of what birds are using as cues. And in general, there's kind of cues at different levels. So changes in photoperiod, which are fairly predictable over time, allow birds to predict temperature shifts that used to be correlated. And as those are becoming increasingly decoupled in climate change or under climate change, you start to see kind of a divergence in their ability to track optimal cues. So that's kind of at a very broad level. And then at a more proximate level, they're probably tying in on kind of when individuals are breeding, although that depends on kind of different systems. So seabirds will cue in on the birds around them breeding much more often than kind of a great tit might. And then on top of that, they're also relying on kind of specific temperature cues in terms of, oh, I can breed right now. Should I breed right now? Oh, no, it's cold outside. I'll wait an extra day. Yeah.
So I was curious, I mean, I can't remember the life expectancy, but I know great tits is sort of adult survival about 50 to 60%, something like that. So I was wondering how age is interacting with this. I mean, if you took, you know, my vague recollection is older individuals breed earlier, and could that to some extent be contributing to higher survival of offspring or lower adult survival the next year? And I wondered if you had looked at it for all two, you know, first-time breeders, second-time breeders, to see if the same effect still held.
Yeah, it's a great question. So in the models that I presented, we didn't include age as a covariate, but that's also because very few birds actually breed more than once in this population. Because it's been going on for such a long period of time, there are a number of records for multiple breeders, and I think the maximum is up to 6 breeding attempts, 6 or 8, somewhere around there. But most birds in the population will actually only breed a single time. So I agree, and I expect that these age effects are probably kind of allowing them to better track environmental conditions, probably breed earlier as well, and probably adjust their kind of provisioning rates to be more optimal. But we were kind of ignoring that because it's not as big a factor in this population as it is for other longer-lived birds as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I was curious about the shape of those curves, you know, the early, medium, and late. So as a, you know, coming into this naive, I would think there'd be a perfect bell curve, but it seems like it's maybe more of a skew almost. And I'm curious, is this, do you think this is generalizable across a lot of species where, you know, early is okay, but late is bad, and you would see that kind of skewed curve?
Yeah, so I came into this expecting that it would be widely generalizable, or if you look at the literature, often they expect it to be like a linear decline has been described, where early is always best and late is always worse. But as we start to consider these non-linear effects, I think we will start to see kind of more hump-shaped distributions or slightly more nuanced effects than just a linear decline.
Yeah, specifically that skew, though.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's definitely constraints on early breeding. And I think those constraints are going to be largely species specific, where if you think of something like a scrub jay or a Canada jay, they have cached food resources so they can buffer themselves in poor environmental conditions. Whereas something like a tree swallow, there's been documented cases of mass mortality in late spring freezes. So I think it would be interesting to look into that in a more kind of expansive way. And we have plans to hopefully try and look at kind of the generalizable nature of this across study populations in Europe of great tits, blue tits, and pied flycatchers, but also try and expand it out and see if life history theory might predict kind of the shape of the distribution or the skewness of the curves as well. But yeah, it's a great question.
You talked a lot about bison in your first example, but that there's also cattle that are one of the effects. Do you know much about the similar or the effects that cattle would have on the similar plant communities?
Yeah, so there's been quite a bit of study that's gone on with that. And so in many ways, they can be seen as kind of parallel processes that promote similar responses. Mm-hmm. But bison impact forbs in particular in some subtle ways as well. Well, not so subtle because it's a bison, but there are wallows and things like that. Mm-hmm. So they'll create wallows where they bathe in mud and all of that sort of thing. And those wallows then accumulate water and become a rich kind of biodiverse source of plant life. And so there's consistency in some respects to how they open up gaps, but then also bison seem to be better at opening up gaps than cattle are, for instance. But I think if the option is kind of not having anything versus having cattle and then having bison, depending on what you're looking for, you could get kind of similar responses. Yeah.
Can you go back to one of those figures?
Yeah.
It looked like, so it was one of those like relative and absolute timing figures for recruits, the number of recruits that were produced.
Yeah.
Cool. It looked like there was some benefit for early breeding in Great Dates at least.
Yeah.
Right. So that like it starts up really high.
Yeah, right there.
And so yeah, what do you make of that? Like is if they're trying to coordinate with the peak in food abundance, why do early breeders succeed so well?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, it's not shared again. Go ahead.
So it's an interesting question where this is like the proportion of young that recruited from these early nests. So it could be maybe a condition dependent response to kind of better adults raising individuals earlier in the year, or it could be that there's almost this buffering of when individuals are breeding earlier in the year, even if they've made it past the nestling phase, then they have access to greater resources as soon as they've fledged.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. And we actually find the same pattern with scrub jays, where the earliest breeders have the highest number of recruits. And while they may actually cope with colder temperatures when they're nestlings, or the parents might have to cope with colder temperatures during the nesting season. So it's really cool to see a similar effect in another species.
Yeah, and so I know we saw that with Canada jays as well. And it's interesting because in both the Canada jays and the scrub jays, they're like queuing for territories and trying to find territories. So you imagine that there's this stronger density dependent kind of effect of breeding early. You have preferential access.
Yeah.
Whereas in the great tits and the blue tits, and even the pied flycatchers, they aren't really settling or defending territories during the winter. They do to a degree, but not as strongly.
Right.
And so it's fascinating that there is this kind of effect on recruitment when it's not necessarily manifesting explicitly through kind of territorial occupancy and those sort of things.
Yeah.
But it is a fairly wide-held pattern as well that earlier birds typically are higher recruits. And I think the mechanisms explicitly behind that aren't well understood in many cases.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. What's the slide?
The very next slide, the female survival rate. You show that figure again. So this seems contradictory to me, and I was hoping you could probably explain it in more simplistic terms, because the left seems to suggest that as you go further in the year, female survival just continues to increase, whereas the right suggests that once you get further from the average lay date, it decreases.
Yeah.
So what's the deal with that?
Yeah, so the first thing to point out is because this is a partial plot, it's kind of fixing different levels. So it's not necessarily the full generalizable pattern, but it largely holds true. And I think it's kind of because this is showing two different things. So in the case of the relative lay date, that's relative to the population mean in a given year. And so that whole distribution could be between days 80 and 100, for instance. Whereas on the left, that's just when did the birds breed in an absolute sense. And so I think in many cases, it's probably highlighting kind of two different processes, which is one on the right or on the left, the absolute sense is kind of if they're breeding later in the year, there might be breeding during the caterpillar peak and during more favorable conditions that could otherwise limit their survival. And so I expect that that's probably why it's manifesting as this kind of late breeder being higher survival. Yeah, it's tricky because it does seem counterintuitive. But I'd expect that maybe it's because it's kind of highlighting two separate processes and kind of two different timescales almost.
Thanks so much, Alex. And yeah,